The winter sun was setting over downtown Atlanta when the emergency dispatch crackled to life. Lead paramedic David Chen grabbed the radio, his heart already picking up pace as he listened to the dispatcher's urgent voice. A 7-year-old boy was struggling to breathe, possibly experiencing a severe asthma attack in the Oakwood subdivision. David exchanged a quick glance with his partner Ray Johnson, both knowing they had precious minutes to save a young life. As Ray fired up the ambulance's engine, David's mind was already running through protocols and procedures. After 12 years on the job, these moments still got his adrenaline pumping. The ambulance's siren cut through the evening traffic, its red and blue lights painting the streets in urgent colors. Inside, David checked their emergency kit for the third time. Pediatric oxygen mask, bronchodilators, everything they might need to help a child fighting for air. His own son was around the same age, and he couldn't help but feel that familiar knot in his stomach. ETA 3 minutes, Ray called out, skillfully maneuvering through the rush hour traffic. Drivers pulled aside, creating a path for the speeding ambulance. The GPS showed them approaching the suburban neighborhood, its quiet streets a stark contrast to the urgency of their mission. The house came into view, a modest 2-story home with toys scattered across the front lawn. Before the ambulance had fully stopped, David was already jumping out, medical bag in hand. Ray followed close behind with the oxygen tank. The front door burst open, and a woman in her early 30s rushed out, panic etched across her face. "Please hurry. He's in here," she called out, leading them inside. The sound of labored breathing grew louder as they entered the living room. There, on the couch, sat a small boy in Spider-Man pajamas, his chest heaving with each desperate attempt to draw in air. His lips were beginning to take on a bluish tinge, a dangerous sign that demanded immediate action. David knelt beside the boy, speaking in calm, reassuring tones while quickly assessing his condition. "Hey buddy, I'm here to help you breathe better. Can you look at me?" The child's frightened eyes met his, tears streaming down his face as he struggled for air. Ray was already preparing the nebulizer, his movements swift and precise. The mother hovered nearby, clutching her son's favorite stuffed dinosaur. "He's had asthma attacks before, but never this bad," she explained, her voice trembling. His inhaler wasn't helping. David nodded, maintaining his focus while inserting the pulse oximeter onto the boy's finger. The reading confirmed his fears. Oxygen saturation was dangerously low. As they worked to establish an airway and administer medication, neither paramedic noticed the curtains in the house across the street being pulled aside, nor the phone call being made that would turn their routine emergency response into something far more complicated. They were too focused on the sight of the boy's chest, finally beginning to rise and fall more steadily, his frightened gasps gradually becoming less desperate. This was only the beginning of what would become one of the most challenging nights of their careers, but for now, all that mattered was the small life they were fighting to save. The moment David and Ray stepped through the front door, they could sense this wasn't going to be a routine emergency call. The living room was warm with fear, the kind that makes the air thick and hard to breathe. Little toys were scattered across the floor, evidence of a normal day turned upside down in seconds. The boy's mother, Mrs. Thompson, watched with trembling hands as they worked. Her son Kevin lay on the couch, his small chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. The coffee table had been pushed aside to make room for their medical equipment, the sound of the oxygen tank's gentle hiss mixing with Kevin's labored breathing. "Pulse is stabilizing," Ray reported, his voice steady as he monitored the vital signs. David nodded, carefully adjusting the oxygen mask on Kevin's face. The medication was starting to work, the blue tinge around his lips slowly fading to a healthier pink. These were the moments that reminded them why they chose this profession. Through the window, the street lights had begun to flicker on, casting long shadows across the suburban landscape. Neither paramedic noticed the growing crowd of neighbors gathering on their porches, whispering among themselves. One particular neighbor, an elderly man who just moved to the area, peered through his curtains with suspicion growing in his eyes. "He's doing much better now," David reassured Mrs. Thompson, who hadn't let go of her son's hand since they arrived. "The nebulizer treatment is helping." Kevin's breathing was becoming more regular, his chest no longer heaving with each breath. A slight smile even crossed his face as David showed him the stethoscope, letting him listen to his own heartbeat. Ray was gathering additional supplies from their kit when the first police siren pierced the evening quiet. He glanced out the window, expecting the patrol car to pass by, but it didn't. Instead, it screeched to a halt right outside the house, its red and blue lights painting the walls in alternating colors. "Did someone call for police backup?" David asked, looking up from his young patient. Mrs. Thompson shook her head, confusion clear on her face. Before anyone could say more, the front door burst open. The sharp beam of flashlights cut through the living room, accompanied by stern voices ordering everyone to freeze. 3 officers entered with their weapons drawn, the lead officer's voice rising above the others. "Step away from the child. Hands where we can see them." The sudden intrusion startled Kevin, who grabbed his mother's arm tighter, his breathing beginning to quicken again. David's hands remained steady on the oxygen mask, knowing that any interruption in treatment could undo all their progress. "We're paramedics," he stated calmly, his voice clear and professional despite the tension coursing through his body. "This child is in the middle of emergency treatment." Ray slowly raised one hand while keeping the other on the medical equipment. "Our credentials are in our front pockets," he explained, maintaining eye contact with the officers. "This boy needs continuous care right now. We can't stop the treatment." Mrs. Thompson found her voice, stepping between the officers and her son. "Please, they're helping him breathe. They're the paramedics I called." The fear in her voice was different now, not just for her son's health, but for the safety of the men trying to save him. The next few moments would test not just their professional training, but their human spirit in ways they never expected. The line between saving a life and protecting their own was about to become dangerously thin. The tension in the living room was electric. 3 police officers stood with their weapons raised, while David and Ray continued treating young Kevin, whose breathing had started to become irregular again due to the stress. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of this surreal standoff. "I said step away from the child." The lead officer commanded again, his flashlight beam unwavering. David kept his voice steady as he responded. "Officer, this boy is receiving emergency respiratory treatment. Moving him now could put his life at risk." His hands remained firmly on the oxygen mask, though his heart was racing beneath his calm exterior. Mrs. Thompson stood between the officers and the paramedics, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "Please listen. I called 911 for my son's asthma attack. These men are saving his life." She held up her phone, showing the emergency call still running on her screen. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, but their weapons remained pointed. Ray continued monitoring Kevin's vital signs, speaking in clear, measured tones. "Officers, I'm going to reach for our department IDs very slowly." He moved his hand gradually toward his pocket, explaining each movement before making it. The lead officer nodded tersely, allowing this small concession. Through the window, more patrol cars had arrived, their lights casting an eerie dance of red and blue across the room's walls. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, some recording with their phones, others watching in shocked silence. Inside, Kevin's eyes darted between the officers and his mother, his small hand clutching his stuffed dinosaur tighter. "Dispatch, we need supervisor confirmation on 2 individuals claiming to be paramedics." One officer spoke into his radio. The response crackled back immediately. "Confirmed." Unit 47 was dispatched to that address for pediatric respiratory distress. Still, the officers maintained their positions, caught between protocol and common sense. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. David focused on Kevin's breathing, which was becoming more stable despite the chaos around them. He spoke softly to the boy. "You're doing great, buddy. Just keep taking nice, slow breaths for me." This simple human connection seemed to cut through the tension, reminding everyone in the room what really mattered. From outside came the sound of another vehicle approaching. Through the window, they could see the familiar white SUV of the EMS supervisor. Relief flooded through both paramedics. Help was finally arriving. But those next few moments, before their supervisor could reach the door, felt like an eternity. Mrs. Thompson had begun to cry silently, her hand never leaving her son's shoulder. The youngest police officer's weapon had started to lower slightly, his certainty visibly wavering as he watched the obvious medical care being provided. The living room, once a place of family memories, had become the stage for a scene that would soon make headlines across the country. The EMS supervisor, Mr. Wilson, burst through the front door, his experienced eyes quickly taking in the scene before him. His presence brought an immediate shift in the room's energy. "These are my medics," he announced firmly, pulling out his department ID. "They're in the middle of treating a critical pediatric patient." The lead officer lowered his weapon slightly but didn't holster it. "We received a call about suspicious activity," he explained, his voice betraying uncertainty. "Protocol requires us to investigate any reported threats." The supervisor's face hardened as he looked at the weapons still pointed at his team. "Your protocols just interrupted emergency medical care for a child," Mr. Wilson stated, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of experience. "My medics have been trying to save this boy's life while staring down gun barrels. Does this look like suspicious activity to you?" Kevin's oxygen levels had finally stabilized, and David carefully adjusted the nebulizer treatment. Ray continued documenting vital signs, both medics maintaining their professionalism despite the adrenaline coursing through their bodies. Mrs. Thompson hadn't moved from her protective stance between the officers and her son. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Cell phone cameras captured every moment through the windows, their lights adding to the surreal atmosphere. The story was already spreading across social media, gaining momentum with each passing minute. The officers finally lowered their weapons completely, the reality of their mistake settling in. The lead officer's face showed the first signs of regret as he watched Kevin take steadier breaths. "We'll need statements from everyone involved," he said, his tone notably softer. "Statements can wait," Mr. Wilson replied firmly. "Right now, we're transporting this patient to Children's Hospital. You can follow us there." He turned to Mrs. Thompson, his voice gentling. "Ma'am, would you like to ride in the ambulance with your son?" As David and Ray prepared Kevin for transport, the boy's eyes remained fixed on them, no longer filled with fear, but with something closer to trust. Despite everything that had happened, they had never stopped caring for him. Mrs. Thompson touched David's arm gently, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving him." The stretcher was carefully maneuvered through the front door, past the now holstered weapons and apologetic faces. The neighbors watched in silence as the small procession made its way to the ambulance, the night air heavy with unspoken words about what they had just witnessed. The ambulance sped through the darkened streets, its siren cutting through the night. Inside, David continued monitoring Kevin's condition while Ray navigated toward Children's Hospital. Mrs. Thompson held her son's hand, her eyes moving between his face and the medical equipment displaying his vital signs. "Your boy's a real fighter," David said softly, adjusting the oxygen flow. Kevin had finally relaxed enough to give a small smile, the worst of the asthma attack behind him. The nebulizer hummed steadily, its medicine helping to keep his airways open. Through the rear window, they could see the police cruiser following at a respectful distance. The hospital's emergency entrance came into view, its bright lights a beacon in the night. The ER team was already waiting, having been notified about both the medical emergency and the incident that followed. As they wheeled Kevin through the automatic doors, several staff members exchanged concerned glances, word of what happened having spread quickly. Inside the treatment room, Dr. Chen took charge of Kevin's care. Her experienced hands quickly assessed his condition while listening to David's report. Severe asthma attack. Treatment interrupted by police intervention. Patient remains stable despite circumstances. Each word seemed to hang in the air, the full weight of what had happened becoming clearer. The police officers who had followed them waited in the hallway, their earlier bravado replaced by uncomfortable shifting and lowered eyes. Hospital security stood nearby, their presence a quiet reminder that things would be different now. A young nurse walked past, casting a sympathetic glance at David and Ray. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed constantly, messages from family, news reporters, and concerned community members pouring in. The video taken by neighbors was already spreading across social media platforms, sparking outrage and calls for change. But here in the hospital room, her focus remained solely on her son. Kevin's breathing had stabilized completely now, the terror of the night beginning to fade from his young face. He looked at David and Ray with curious eyes, perhaps not fully understanding why these men had stayed so calm while helping him, even with guns pointed at them. His mother squeezed his hand, fighting back fresh tears. Dr. Chen finished her examination and turned to the paramedics with clear respect in her eyes. "You did everything right," she said firmly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Your quick thinking and dedication likely saved this child's life." The words seemed to carry extra weight, acknowledging not just their medical skills, but their courage under pressure. As night settled over the hospital, the atmosphere in the emergency department remained charged with tension. David and Ray sat in the break room, finally taking a moment to process the events that had unfolded. Their supervisor, Mr. Wilson, walked in with 2 cups of coffee and a grim expression on his face. "The police chief wants to speak with both of you," he said, setting the cups down. "But first, I need to know you're both okay." The simple question broke something loose. David's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Down the hall, Kevin had fallen asleep, his breathing now steady and strong. Mrs. Thompson sat beside his bed, scrolling through her phone with increasing concern. The video of the incident had gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments. News vans were already gathering outside the hospital. The police chief arrived with his deputy, both looking somber. Rather than meeting in an office, they gathered in the quiet hospital chapel, neutral ground. "What happened tonight was unacceptable," the chief began, his voice heavy with responsibility. "We failed you, we failed that child, and we failed our community." Ray spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "We're trained to handle emergencies, Chief. But having guns pointed at us while trying to save a child's life, that's not something they prepare you for in paramedic school." David nodded, remembering the weight of those moments, the split-second decisions to keep treating Kevin despite the threats. Outside the chapel, hospital staff paused as they passed by, some offering supportive nods. Word had spread quickly through the medical community, touching a nerve among all emergency responders. A young resident doctor stopped to leave 2 more cups of coffee, a small gesture of solidarity. Mrs. Thompson appeared at the chapel door, her eyes red but her stance determined. "The media wants statements," she said quietly. "But before that, I need you both to know something." She paused, gathering her strength. "You didn't just save my son's life. You showed him what real heroes look like." The police chief stood, understanding the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about trust, about systemic changes needed, about the daily reality faced by dedicated professionals who just wanted to help others. The conversations that would follow would be difficult, but necessary. In the days following the incident, the story took on a life of its own. Local news stations camped outside the hospital, their cameras capturing the steady stream of visitors bringing flowers and cards to Kevin's room. The boy had become a symbol of something larger than himself, though he was mostly excited about missing school and getting extra pudding cups from the nurses. David and Ray returned to work, despite offers to take time off. People still need help, David explained simply to a reporter who caught him between shifts. His words resonated across social media, shared thousands of times alongside images from that night. The photos showed two paramedics focused entirely on saving a child while guns were pointed at their backs. The police department launched a full investigation. Body camera footage revealed the full extent of what happened. The calm professionalism of the paramedics, Mrs. Thompson's desperate pleas, and Kevin's bravery through it all. When the footage was released, it sparked nationwide conversations about reform and recognition. Community leaders organized a town hall meeting at the local community center. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls. David and Ray sat quietly in the back, listening as speakers shared similar experiences. Mrs. Thompson took the podium, her voice strong despite her emotions. "My son is alive because these men refused to step away," she said, gesturing toward the paramedics. "They chose his life over their own safety. But they should never have had to make that choice." The room erupted in applause, many wiping away tears. Kevin recovered fully and returned home, greeting David and Ray with a big hug when they visited to check on him. He proudly showed them his new drawing, stick figures wearing paramedic uniforms, standing tall like superheroes. His mother had framed it, hanging it in the living room where everything had happened. The police chief announced major changes to department protocols. "We're implementing new training programs," he explained at a press conference. "Every officer will learn to better recognize and respect emergency medical personnel." What happened that night will become a teaching moment for departments across the country. Throughout it all, David and Ray maintained their usual schedule, responding to calls, saving lives, making a difference. But something had shifted, in the way other first responders greeted them, in the grateful nods from strangers who recognized them, in the knowledge that their actions that night had sparked necessary changes. 1 month after the incident, David stood before a packed auditorium at the police academy. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming, but his eyes carried the weight of experience. Beside him, Ray prepared their presentation on emergency medical response protocols, a new mandatory training program for all police cadets. "When we arrive on scene," David began, his voice steady, "every second counts. That night with Kevin taught us all something important." The room was silent, hundreds of faces focused intently on his words. Among the audience sat Mrs. Thompson and Kevin, now fully recovered and proudly wearing a toy stethoscope around his neck. The presentation included body camera footage from that night, but also something more powerful, personal stories from other emergency responders who had faced similar situations. Each account added another layer to the growing understanding of how crucial those first moments of emergency response could be. Kevin raised his hand during the question period, surprising everyone. "Did you feel scared?" he asked simply. The room held its breath, waiting for the answer. David knelt to the boy's eye level, just as he had done that night. "Yes," he admitted, "but being brave doesn't mean not feeling scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." The police commissioner announced new identification protocols for emergency responders, including improved communication between dispatch centers and patrol units. "What happened that night will never happen again," he promised, looking directly at David and Ray. "Your courage has helped us build a better system." Local schools began inviting the paramedics to speak about their work. Children would gather around, especially fascinated by Kevin's story. "Sometimes heroes wear uniforms," one teacher explained to her class, "and sometimes they're just people doing their jobs with extraordinary courage." The neighbor who had made the original call came forward, tearfully apologizing at a community meeting. "I let fear cloud my judgment," she admitted. "I never stopped to think about the consequences of that call." Her honesty sparked important conversations about prejudice and assumptions. The incident became a case study in emergency response training nationwide. But for David and Ray, the most meaningful change was simpler. The way Kevin's face lit up every time they drove past his house, Sirens silent this time, just checking in on the boy who had taught them all about courage. 1 year later, the small park across from the hospital was packed with people. A new training center was being dedicated, the Emergency Response Unity Center. David and Ray stood near the podium, their families beside them, watching as Mrs. Thompson cut the ribbon with Kevin's help. This center represents more than just a building, the mayor announced. It stands for the changes we've made together. Inside, training rooms were equipped with state-of-the-art simulation technology. One wall displayed photos from that pivotal night, now used to teach first responders about maintaining focus under pressure. Kevin, now 8 and breathing easy, had become a regular visitor at the local fire station. His school project about community heroes had won first place, featuring interviews with David and Ray. More importantly, his story had inspired a new generation of young people interested in emergency services. The police department reported significant improvements in emergency response coordination. Joint training sessions between police and paramedics had become standard practice. The neighbor who made the call that night now volunteered at community outreach programs, sharing her story as a lesson in overcoming prejudice. David and Ray continued their regular shifts, though they'd taken on additional roles as instructors at the new center. "We teach about medical procedures," Ray explained to a documentary crew, "but more importantly, we teach about humanity in crisis situations." Mrs. Thompson began advocating for better emergency response protocols nationwide. Her speeches often ended with a simple truth: "My son's story could have ended differently." Instead, it became a beginning, a catalyst for change that's saving lives across the country. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story featuring Kevin's original drawing, now framed in the training center's entrance. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Courage is doing what's right, especially when it's hard." The journalist noted how visitors often paused there, reflecting on how one night changed so many lives. As David finished his last training session of the day, he spotted Kevin waiting outside with his mother. The boy proudly showed off his new asthma-free report from the doctor. Sometimes the biggest victories came in the smallest moments: a child breathing easily, a community healing, and the knowledge that positive change was possible.